What is going on, guys? Verkdevoten here, and today I'm going to do a very small amount of tanking for ESO, and then we're going to switch gears and gather herbs and materials and knowledge about how America is no longer a constitutional republic, but basically an oligarchy. And how we're going to do that is that we're going to listen to this podcast called Lever Time. And today it's with, I'm going to say this name wrong, David Sirota. I think that's how you say it. I haven't listened to this yet, but the the title of the podcast is pretty catchy. It says "The Secret Plot to Buy American Democracy." I don't think it was very secret. I mean, maybe this is just in hindsight because this happened in like the 70s and then reaffirmed by Clarence Thomas, I think, what was it, like 2010, I want to say, when Citizens United. So what I'm hoping to go over is kind of the historical context of how conservatives in America basically made this long-term plan to break down. I don't know if I guess administrative state is really the most common word for it, but what I want to use is like the blue collar workers who keep the government running, and this is what, Trump talked about with his Schedule F and basically dissolving civil servants throughout the government, like people who are experts in their field with like civil engineering, or maybe they work for the EPA because they are an industrial hygienist or something. Basically taking all those people who are super knowledgeable, they are experts in their field, and they help keep the government running and keep people's lives from like just dissipating for the bottom dollar. That has slowly, and I think it's accelerated now, just been broken apart. And this unfortunately also allows, the free flow of money into our elections, and has for the last 45 years. So yeah, let's see what it is, but I'll jump into a quick little dungeon here, and then we'll just kind of take it from there.
The Lever. Subscriber-supported journalism that holds power accountable.
Okay, I'm already a little disappointed. That opening that opening does not fit the title, "The Secret Plot to Buy American Democracy." Expected it to be a little bit more Arnold Schwarzenegger, but whatever.
From the Lever's reader-supported newsroom, this is Lever Time. I'm Arjun Singh. 2024 might just turn out to be the revenge of the memos. Nearly 50 years ago, two conservative thinkers wrote a pair of memos that mapped out a right-wing takeover of the government. In the Powell memo, former Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell rallied the business community and called on them to be more aggressive in using their wealth to muscle into places like the Supreme Court, and then pack it with corporate-friendly judges. 9 years later, another lawyer, Michael Horowitz, urged conservatives to take things a step further. He called on corporations and right-wing activists to go into law schools and indoctrinate generations of lawyers to twist the law to their advantage. The result? A political system awash in millions of dollars in dark money, and a right-wing Supreme Court that seems hell-bent on dismantling the guardrails of democracy.
So there's a lot to unpack right there, and I'm not going to do it in real time, but from the framing, I'm guessing what they're doing is that I want to keep something in mind when they talk about Powell on the Supreme Court back in the 70s, who wrote this memo. He wrote the memo, I thought, before when he was I want to say he was like a circuit court judge, and he wrote this memo and he sent it to Nixon, and Nixon, because of that memo, put him on the Supreme Court, and that's how we got the subsequent judgments in our legal system, where we now define, like, corporations are legal people. Like, they're, in the eyes of the law, they are individuals, as much real as you or I. And this is what really started the deterioration of holding people accountable, because the company, the LLC, the, S corp, whatever it is, right? That is who gets punished, not the people in the company running the company making the decisions, right? They just, like, CEOs just get fired, but the board members, no one gets sued or anything. The company does, but not the individuals. And you don't see this in other countries, because again, it erodes the basic premise of democracy. But this is, America.
These memos have been around for decades. They're now receiving renewed scrutiny, thanks to two powerful pieces of journalism. One is the Lever's own podcast series Master Plan, and the other a new book from journalist David Daley. Today on Lever Time, I'm going to sit down first with David Sirota and Jared Marr and hear how the Powell memo set the stage for the corruption of our political system by money. Then, David Daley and I will discuss how the Horowitz memo created a legal society that would go on to play a major role in helping Donald Trump try and steal the 2020 election.
Bum, bum, bum.
David, welcome back to Lever Time. I'm excited. We're joined with our colleague, Jared Marr. So, for listeners who I know have probably been missing you here on Lever Time, you have been working on a phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal piece of journalism. It's called Master Plan. David, if you could just sort of explain what's the master plan and what is kind of the conceptual through line that is happening here in the series and that you guys have been reporting on.
The master plan was a plan to try to make the government less responsive to what the population wants. It was hatched at a time when the government was doing all sorts of things that the population was demanding and that the people in power didn't really want. So this is the late 60s, early 70s, the time of the creation of Medicare, Medicaid, civil rights laws, voting rights laws, the EPA, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act.
Sorry, I have to pause it there because this actually now directly refers to my own career. Since COVID, I made a pivot. I made a pivot from pre and post rehab work into basically being the OSHA representative for private company, right? So I am steeped in OSHA, EPA, DOT regulation, all that stuff. Now, why I bring that up is that the irony is that the EPA, the Clean Water Act, OSHA, all those acts that precipitated this sort of event and this idea that conservatives need to dismantle the guardrails of protecting its citizens in America. All of those things came from Nixon. Well, almost all of them came from Nixon, a Republican, one of the arguably the most corrupt. Well, I don't know. I'll stick with relatively one of the most corrupt presidents in America. So the irony here is basically Nixon listened to people, listened to the data, right, and pass all these laws basically saying you can't dump here, you can't exploit workers like this, you can't allow this into the air. It's just mind-blowing to me. And I think unfortunately because of Nixon's corruption and contempt for people that rally against him, that's kind of his legacy. He's the guy who opened up trade with China, right? He is almost single-handedly responsible for the development of our global economy right now, and it's so ironic to see that same party just going not even goose stepping but just running towards pure authoritarianism.
The government declaring a war on poverty. At the time, those who had a lot of power were worried that they were losing their power. We're talking about the corporate community. We're talking about oligarchs of the era. They were worried about this. And a guy named Lewis Powell, who was at the pinnacle of the elite establishment, head of the American Bar Association, a tobacco industry lawyer, corporate lawyer, he wrote a memo, really a manifesto to the Chamber of Commerce, saying that business needed to essentially reassert itself and gain a lot more power over the government because the government had become too problematically responsive to what the population wanted. And what we focus in on in our series is how one of the pillars of what they realized they needed to do was to take over the judiciary and deregulate the campaign finance and anti-corruption laws. That essentially they understood that in a functioning one person, one vote democracy, the government was going to continue to be too responsive from their perspective to what the public wanted. And so they needed to use the thing that they had a disproportionate amount of in society.
And again, sorry, this actually ties back to the founding of America during the Constitutional Convention. This is why Southern slave owners basically forced the rest of the nation, strong arm threatening to ally themselves with a, foreign power right after the American Revolution, to basically say like, hey, we don't have enough people in these southern states. We are a bunch of rich landowning slave owners, and we don't have the votes. If it was a 1-to-1 vote, we're going to lose in a presidential election every time. And that's how the Electoral College came about, and the 3/5 clause. So keep that in mind.
Which is money, and that they needed to be able to use that money to buy elections, legislation, court rulings, and the like. And so what we trace is from this Lewis Powell manifesto how a conservative legal movement was built, which secured various rulings that deregulated the campaign finance system, which made it essentially legal for money to now buy political outcomes that typically don't serve the general population, but do serve to enrich the people who are spending the money.
And Jared, I know that you've been working really closely with David. If listeners, go ahead and listen to the series, they're going to hear you on the series. So in the first few episodes, you go back to Nixon, as David was mentioning. Lewis Powell is a very prominent figure in this. Why does the story start with Watergate and then Lewis Powell? What is it about this memo in particular that is either so revelatory, or is it that this memo had a lot of influence that we can track later?
Well, when we first outlined the trajectory of this historic story, it was mostly focused on campaign finance reform and Supreme Court cases starting in the 70s, going up to the 80s and 90s. And as we started digging more into those cases, we thought, oh, well, this first legislation was passed in reaction or around Watergate. Okay, well, let's look into Watergate. Oh, there was also something to do with this Supreme Court justice that Nixon appointed named Lewis F. Powell. And hey, this memo is pretty interesting. I think I've heard about this before. And that kind of kicked us off on looking more into the origins of the memo, why it was written, and the actual impacts that it had. And if listeners aren't familiar with the Powell memo, the best way I can describe the memo is that it's a kind of a mix between a manifesto and a business plan. The manifesto portion being that the business community, the free enterprise system, as Lewis Powell described it, was under attack by the forces of the left and other advocates who wanted to push greater regulation on private enterprise. And
oh, if that sounds familiar to you as a political stump speech talking point, that's because it's been literally tale as old as time, right? Government, or that's not government, it's free market enthusiasts who want to exploit labor. Again, tale as old as time, whether you want to call it a monarch, the pharaohs, British slave owners, whatever, right? They want cheap labor for their own purpose of amassing wealth, right? Just for the sake of amassing wealth and being more powerful, stroke their egos. It'll never stop until we realize Gene Roddenberry's, idea of how humanity should be. You're always going to hear this.
And the economy. And that was his call to arms for the business community. The business plan portion of it was how he laid out in very detailed, very clear-eyed manner about the different areas in which the business community could focus on to invest their money and time to turn the tides on the direction that they feared the country was going. Our big question was, did the memo actually have the impact that a lot of people looking back say that it had? And then that pushed us to really examine that, going to archives, going to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and finding they didn't really have much about this memo or its impact, but not stopping there, looking at other people who were involved and kind of hitting the gold mine with certain documents that showed, yes, in fact, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce started an entire task force over the course of several years that then outlined how they were going to execute the memo, bringing in some of the most powerful business leaders in America and really involving a who's who of folks that would later become pretty prominent in the conservative movement, in politics, and also had the impact of what we sort of see today with some of the big organizations involved in things like Project 2025 with the Heritage Foundation.
Is this the meeting that happens at like Disney World and they all get together and they make this task force, as you said? So what does that mean exactly? They make a task force and then what? Like, is there an actual master plan that's developed there, or is it more like they kind of get together and they're like, we should start working together more in tandem?
Well, it would be one thing if it was just a few get-togethers, because people have meetings all the time and, people might talk about things. Where it actually turned into action was that we had this one meeting that we found the agenda for, which took place at Disney World.
I love that
Disney
fact,
World,
by the way.
And I don't know if you remember this, David, but when I sort of came across that document and I forwarded it to you and I was like, what is going on here? They literally met at Disney World in Florida.
Yeah.
And they, but that was just the beginning, right? So they brought some of these major business leaders involved with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce together, formed this really elaborate task force, and then released something called the Business Response to the Powell Memorandum about a year later, which outlined all the specific ways that these different subcommittees had decided they were going to focus on education, the judiciary, electoral politics. And that's not even where it stops, because the Powell Memo's reach even extended past the Chamber of Commerce types and prompted other meetings from different coalitions of people. One other meeting that took place in Dallas, organized by the Young Presidents Organization. Other meetings in New York with the Freedoms Foundation, involving a lot of different people that would go on to fund their own ventures focused on the different areas that Powell outlined.
So these guys get together, they are fighting what they see as the excess of the government on the ability of corporations and basically rich people to do what they want. I don't want to give too much of the podcast away, but as the series goes on, you move throughout history into the 80s and eventually you're going to get to the present. David, do you see the Powell Memo as being something that, it's followed through in the way that Jared was saying, that they have this task force and it's like, an agenda task list? Or was it more of like the Powell Memo opens up a Pandora's box, and from there we see politics become what it is today, a world of dark money and super PACs and corporate lunacy and absurd fundraising requirements? Is it kind of a chicken and the egg thing that I'm describing right here?
I see it as akin to the other well-known manifestos of the 20th century, whether it was 19th and 20th centuries. I mean, whether it was the Communist Manifesto, whether it's Mao's Little Red Book, whether it's any of the other famous manifestos of the time, which is to say that it counsels a specific set of areas to focus on, and it gets relatively granular about where it prescribes a political focus on, but it also is something short of a pure blueprint. So it's a mix of, here are the areas to focus on, and also an ideological call to arms. And I think it's important to understand that, to understand what actually came out of it. And so I think it's fair to say, no, it's not like they read the Powell memo and the Powell memo is not like, for instance, Project 2025, which is a detailed blueprint for exactly what a president should do, to the point where it's designed to be a plug-and-play agenda. The Powell memo is more of a manifesto in that it is laying out broad goals, broad areas to focus on, with the ideological arguments for doing this. But what we do know is that manifestos tend to, frankly, be the most successful ones, tend to be more far-reaching and inspire all of the subsequent blueprints. So I think Project 2025 is like an implementation document of a specific part of the Powell memo. The Powell memo, I think, catalyzed, crystallized, and harnessed a lot of different strands of discontent back then, corporate discontent, and let 1,000 or really 1,000,000 flowers bloom from it. And I also think it's important to understand just what the Powell memo was counseling. The Powell memo has a line in there in which Lewis Powell is effectively, in my mind, is trying to urge an entire repudiation of the New Deal. The New Deal politics at the time was the dominant political paradigm. And there's a line in there which I would guess that he was deliberately invoking as a refutation of the New Deal.
So if you're ever confused when Republicans sort of randomly call out the New Deal or use the New Deal as a slight, and younger viewers, people getting into politics, are like, what the hell are they talking about? This kind of shows, as he said, like how powerful these memos are and how they become mantras within the party. And I would argue that the New Deal became a mantra within the Democratic Party. And I kind of feel like it's still well, we won't go into that. But yeah, so if you ever wonder why, random congressmen on the right they're almost like they obviously weren't alive during the New Deal, and you're wondering like why they're referencing it, that's why.
It's so fascinating how he put this in here. It's kind of like an Easter egg. He wrote, quote, "In terms of political influence with respect to the course of legislation and government action, the American business executive is truly the forgotten man." Now, if you remember, FDR invoked the forgotten man.
These unhappy times call for the building up of plans that rest upon the forgotten, the unorganized, but the indispensable units of economic power. For plans like those of 1917 that build from the bottom up and not from the top down, that put their faith once more in the forgotten man at the bottom of the economic pyramid.
That was a very well-known statement from Franklin Roosevelt to effectively justify and promote the New Deal. That was in 1932. So about almost exactly 40 years later, you have Lewis Powell writing this memo saying, actually, the forgotten man is the businessman, not the person at the bottom of the economic period, but we, the business people.
Yeah.
I think he was invoking that at a time when the conservative movement was coming together in a more powerful way to make a rejection of the New Deal very explicit. I mean, even if you look at Eisenhower and even Nixon, these were Republican presidents, but they were not explicitly rejecting the New Deal paradigm.
Yeah.
What the Powell memo is doing is calling for a counter-revolution to the...
I'm going to stop it right there real quick. I think I've made reference to this in several of these recordings that I put out to Eisenhower Republicans. And what that typically means is that Eisenhower was the last, I think, sensible and non-sort of, well, I don't want to say hawkish. He wasn't a warmonger. Like, Eisenhower is the Republican president who warned us against the military-industrial complex, what we have right now, right? So most of America's money, that the GDP that America makes, is from making machines of war, ammunition, rocket, whatever, right? That's why we keep selling to Israel. That's why we keep selling to Qatar. That's why we keep selling to Saudi Arabia, and, you know, via third parties, even Iran. That's how Iran gets a hold of American weapons. Is we're literally we don't say that we're selling them weapons, right? But that's what we're doing. Kind of on a tangential note, if you haven't seen the movie Lord of War with Nicolas Cage and Jared Leto, watch it. It's amazing. Yeah, it's a fictional movie, but it's very, very historically accurate on the story that is based on.
New Deal. And I think, again, that line about who is the forgotten man is a very explicit a reminder of that.
Yeah.
And David, what you said makes me also think that this was also a period when this group of people, this burgeoning movement, was looking for its voice. Right. And what the Powell memo did was stylistically give them a voice. Not only we're the forgotten man, we are the victims, but also you need to not be afraid to fight back rhetorically. And those statements, more than anything else, I think, from the letters I reviewed, from all the agenda meetings, from the correspondence back and forth between people, that was the message that really invigorated them. It's like
a rallying cry for them.
We need to be aggressive with our rhetoric.
Yeah.
Not shy away from getting involved in politics, not shying away from going on the attack. And tonally, the shift that took place with the Chamber of Commerce alone, and groups like the National Association of Manufacturers, you see groups like the Business Roundtable, you see wealthy industrialists like Joseph Coors, head of Coors Brewery, take that more than anything to heart, that we need to tonally shift how we are going to present our side to the public, and, like Powell said, not be afraid to vigorously defend and attack our opponents.
So it sort of gives them like a sense of class consciousness, almost like we are banded together and we have these shared goals and ideals. You know, Jared, I know that David has been looking into these issues, he's been focused on these issues for a long time, but, you know, I'm curious to hear from you now that you are wrapping up Master Plan. You've spent all this time reporting. Did it change the way that you think about our democracy, our elections? Like, for you personally, what has been the most revelatory takeaways, if you had any, about, you know, America, our government, our institutions?
I think when I jumped aboard this project and sort of looked at David's outline and the thesis that he wanted to create for the story, a lot of the things were somewhat familiar to me, right? The particular court cases, things like Citizens United, and then broadly, like some of the groups that were pushing for these changes to campaign finance law, these outside groups, and where the funding came from. Like, all that is pretty well known. I think what this story has done for me is two things. This made me both very despondent in some ways, but then also optimistic in other ways. And I kind of toggle between those.
I'm glad there's the optimism
as we go through it. it's despondent because when you track the full broad history over the course of 50 years, and specifically when it comes to the law and the Supreme Court, how narrowly and deeply they've been able to lock up this particular topic of free speech versus election donations, right? Mm-hmm. And how the avenues for changing and getting back to a place where we are able to better regulate or keep money, big money out of politics just seems kind of hard to see where that goes from here without some pretty dramatic changes. So that's really where, you know, I'm curious about. I think that there's ways that this can happen, but mm-hmm. you know, from seeing how this is all played out, you're kind of like, well, where do we go from here? Now, optimistically, part of what we did when we looked at this was, you know, we started in the 1970s, but even further back, we could really see how the reforms that America has undertaken against corruption, how this has been a reoccurring theme, and it happens almost in cycles, right? You had the early 20th century with the progressive reforms. You had the reforms after Watergate, which we track, and then you have things like the McCain-Feingold reforms in the 1990s. And you can see how all of those efforts didn't just happen by accident, right? And you see how hard it was for the reformers and how unique the particular politics and incentives had to be at those moments in order for a system to change itself. Because that's really what we're looking at here. You're requiring on the people who are used to the system of money, being the ones to actually make the changes to themselves, right? And it happened several times, usually prompted by major corruption scandals that then gave the incentives and the public pressure to make changes. And, you know, you can see how they did it, right? They did it before, and it can definitely be done again, because at some of those other moments, it seemed as dire, I think, to those reformers as it does now to the reformers of today, but still, inevitably it seems to happen in order to keep the democracy on track once all is said and done.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the optimism. I share it with you, and I think master plan can be one step in, you know, going further to try and help these reforms get there. The reception's been awesome. Podcast is fantastic. Everybody go check it out. You can get it on levernews.com. You can get it wherever you find your podcasts. Jared, David, thank you both for joining me today. It was great to get to chat with you.
Thank you.
So I'm a little confused. This is a 50-minute podcast and we're only 22 minutes into it. So I'm not sure. Again, I haven't listened to it yet. Wherever they go, I may stop it short if I'm just not interested, but let's give it a shot.
After the break, I'll sit down with journalist David Daly to hear about another influential legal memo, one that he argues paved the way for Donald Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 presidential election.
Okay, I'm interested.
Wow, what a beautiful day. Thank you.
Remember back in 2020 when Rudy Giuliani asked everyone to meet him at the Four Seasons in Philadelphia?
Campaign, an attorney for the president, to describe to you the first part of a situation that is extremely troubling.
It was November 7th, 4 days after Election Day, and Giuliani was sweating, literally sweating. Oh, and it's worth noting that even though he said the conference was happening at the Four Seasons, which is the name of a popular hotel brand, this ended up happening in the parking lot of a place called Four Seasons Total Landscaping. And instead of a lush hotel lobby, they were just standing in the middle of a parking lot.
Let me emphasize, this is only 2 or 3 of about 50 people so far that have given us statements, affidavits, recordings. We're going to have many, many witnesses. It's not a small case. It can be a big case.
It's kind of hard not to laugh at this scene. It looked like Donald Trump had lost the election, and Giuliani is in the middle of a random parking lot, sweat mixing with his hair dye, causing a stray line of hair dye to sit on the side of his face. But what he was saying was anything but funny. That day, Giuliani told reporters the Trump team was planning on overturning the results of the election and challenging it in court. This would eventually be known as the Stop the Steal movement. For months, Trump had refused to say whether he'd accept the results of the election if he lost.
There's fraud. They found them in creeks. They found some with the name Trump, just happened to have the name Trump just the other day in a waste paper basket. They're being sent all over the place. They sent 2 in a Democrat area. They sent out 1,000 ballots. Everybody got 2 ballots. This is going to be a fraud like you've never seen.
And armed with a team of lawyers, he aggressively tried to overturn the results. In some cases, Trump directly pressured election officials, like Georgia's Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, to conjure up more votes to give him a victory in the state.
So, look, all I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have, because we won the state.
Those efforts targeted election workers, several of whom reported facing death threats and suffering from PTSD because of the rage Trump and his allies stoked against them. And ultimately, that led to January 6th, 2021, and the storming of the Capitol.
But if we're right, a lot of them will go to jail.
Why did you say if?
Let's have trial by combat.
And the thing is it was based on nothing. There was no legitimate evidence of fraud in any of the states, yet a fleet of lawyers were happy to help Trump overturn a democratic election. A lot of those lawyers came from a group known as the Federalist Society, a conservative legal group that is led in part by a wealthy activist named Leonard Leo. Leo, along with the Federalist Society, have been the legal backbone of the conservative push to take over the courts. The Federalist Society's origins came in the form of a memo. Not the Powell memo. This one was called the Horowitz memo, and it was written 9 years later. In his new book, Anti-Democratic, Inside the Far Right's 50-Year-Old Plot to Control American Elections, journalist David Daley chronicles the rise of the Federalist Society. I sat down with him the other day to discuss his new book and how his research relates to what David and Jared just told us about Master Plan.
We completely agree on the importance of the Powell memo. Lewis Powell wrote what was effectively a roadmap for big business to get involved in politics, to counter what a future Justice Lewis Powell believed to be the insidious nature of left-wing control of American society and campus and the mass media. Sounds a lot like Leonard Leo today, doesn't he? And he was deeply influential on the Koch brothers, on Richard Mellon Scaife, on all of the conservative founders who built so much of the scaffolding of the conservative right. One of the things that they didn't do particularly effectively, though, was build legal institutions. What the right did, they built the American Enterprise Institute and the Heritage Foundation, and the Koch brothers got underway. But they also built this entire series of conservative public interest law foundations around the country that didn't have the influence that Powell suggested that they would, and donors got a little frustrated with it. So there was a man named Michael Horowitz who was a real student of what the left had done with regards to public interest law in really building power in Washington and working with the government and the regulatory agencies in order to bring about environmental gains and, safer cars. And Horowitz took a look at what the left was doing and said, guys, we're doing this all wrong on the right. We are invested in this big, sprawling regional network, and the power is in Washington, D.C., and you're trying to do this big top-down thing when really what you've got to do is go ground up. Our legal power, he said, our brain power is appallingly mediocre. And what we have to do is go into law schools. We have to win hearts and minds and convince people that they are doing something important. They're not defending DDT. They're not defending General Motors. They are part of a conservative movement that can actually affect hearts and minds. And so when the donors are asked around the same time to give money to this new entity called the Federalist Society, all of these big organizations had read and digested the conclusions of the Horowitz report. And when he brought around these young conservatives, they were primed and ready because of what Michael Horowitz had done. He set out a different direction for the conservative legal movement, a course correction.
And so out of this movement comes a guy who is currently the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts. Now, when you read like institutionalist, like, I don't want to say press, but like people who really believe in like the institutionalism of things, they kind of describe him as this moderate, as someone who's trying to salvage his court from these renegade right wingers. But you tell a very different story of our Chief Justice. Tell me about John Roberts and where he fits into this story. And, you know, I should say that this story is going to lead to the court system, or at least people from the Federalist Society, that ilk, trying to eventually overturn democratic law. And this is kind of who our Chief Justice appears to have come out of. So tell me about John Roberts and the role he plays in this story.
We could talk about John Roberts for hours and hours. And Roberts really is the linchpin in many ways of this. I mean, if originalism was designed to look like a neutral theory masquerading as a means of getting to conservative laws.
I'm gonna stop in here for those that think originalism is this sort of archaic legal idea. This is relatively new. It's only about 20, 25 years old. And the great irony of this is that John Roberts, hopefully he is the Chief Justice right now of our Supreme Court, and he is the one who penned the limited Trump immunity. And he did so over, I think it's over 100 pages. His opinion that talked about presidential immunity. Here's the irony. He calls himself an originalist, but there is presidential immunity is not in the Constitution. It's not written in there anywhere. And this is the same argument that they use to overturn Roe versus Wade, that abortion right isn't in the Constitution anywhere, so we have to leave it up to the states. But presidential immunity, he goes on to, and he creates this he almost writes a faux pas history book, is his opinion, justifying limited presidential immunity, which every president up until Trump has never had or needed. So when I talk about the Conservative Party being Nazikins, I don't mean that hyperbolically. I mean that quite literally. And this sort of act is what is empowering Trump to continue his racist tirade against minorities and whip up his fucking white supremacist base.
Roberts is sort of the human version of that as Chief Justice. He was sent from Chief Justice Central casting, from an Indiana boyhood with his tousled brown hair and his 2 kids, and he stands before the country in 2005 and he pledges to be an umpire, the civic religion of baseball, right? He's just going to call balls and strikes. And for some reason, perhaps because the media is designed in such a way at the Supreme Court to believe that these justices are intellectual gods and not politicians, and
deify them in a way.
That image has stayed with him, even though if you look at the court and the nation that Roberts took over in 2005 and where that court is today in 2024, there's been a sea change. The Constitution has moved decisively rightward. and in ways that the conservative legal movement could only have dreamed of, right? I mean, if you go back to 2005, abortion rights had effectively just been reaffirmed at this court. Campaign finance laws had just been reaffirmed in McConnell versus FEC. The court was not particularly interested in guns at all. What Roberts has done on voting rights, on guns, on reproductive rights, on the regulatory state, on the unitary executive theory with the major questions doctrine, with the immunity decision, is to deliver conservatives a series of major policy victories that they never ever could have won at the ballot box, and he's done so while maintaining his reputation as a moderate. It's I talk about a master plan.
Yeah, it's astounding, actually. And when I think about John Roberts, I think about the 2000 election between George W. Bush and Al Gore, and how that election came down to the vote in Florida. And Florida was down in the first count to like this really tiny margin of like a couple hundred votes, and a recount was supposed to happen. And George Bush's legal team came into the state, and part of that legal team were John Roberts, Brett Kavanaugh, Amy Coney Barrett, and they kind of tried to work the rest on the Supreme.
Oh, did those two names seem familiar to you? Kavanaugh and Barrett on the legal team overturning the 2020 election for Bush, two of which now sit on the Supreme Court? Yeah. Go ahead and tell me that we are still a democracy.
And eventually the Supreme Court intervenes, and they freeze the recount. They say that the recount shouldn't go through. And as time has gone on, there's been a lot of analysis of what happened in that election. There are a lot of irregularities in terms of ballots. There were people who had reported thinking that they had voted for Al Gore, but because of the way that the ballot was structured, they may have voted for George Bush. Holes weren't completely punched. And the thrust of it is that a recount was supposed to happen, and the recount never happened. Looking back at that, I know a lot of people feel very stung by that, and it felt like, you look at it now, it's almost like an earlier version of the Donald Trump efforts, which was to intervene in the democratic process and stop it for political gain. To you, David, is there something about the fact, that someone like John Roberts was actively trying to help the Bush campaign work the referees in a way to get this victory, unlike the straight umpire he's portraying himself to be, who says, hey, listen, let them work it out and the system will do well? Like, what do you make of that?
Bush versus Gore in many ways is proof of concept for the conservative legal movement's plan to capture the judiciary and control American elections through it. It was effectively a jump ball tiebreaker election, and because the right held the court 5-4, they were able to hold the presidency 5-4. And it's not only John Roberts who worked on that case. You had a young Brett Kavanaugh working on that case, and a young Amy Coney Barrett.
Yeah.
So you had 3 of the 6 future members of the conservative supermajority cutting their teeth on this crucial political case that was so poorly reasoned, right, that Scalia called it bullshit. And the court effectively put an asterisk by it, saying that it's a precedent that's not a precedent and really not ever to be applied again. But this time, this is the...
Oh, and does that sound like the limited Trump immunity case? I think it does, because I guarantee you, if Biden or President Kamala Harris do some official act that someone is going to sue them for, I am willing to bet every last penny that I have that if it gets to the Supreme Court, they will hear it and they will not reject it on the precedent that they set.
Way it's going to go, and there's 5 Republicans here and 4 Democrats, and so the recount is halted. George Bush is president, and that in many ways, I think, told Leonard Leo and others all that they needed to know about the importance of the courts.
I feel like, there has been so much attention rightfully put on what happened when Donald Trump tried to overturn the election. But in the years preceding that, there felt like there was quite a bit of anti-democratic effort. You talked about it in one of your books, Rat Fucked, which is about gerrymandering. We were talking about that at the top. Before we get to the kind of 2016, the 2020, the Trump era, when you have after, say, the 2000s, after Bush v. Gore, what are some of the ways that anti-democratic attempts take place via the court system? And I guess one that I'm thinking about a lot is a Supreme Court case, Shelby County versus Holder. John Roberts is by this point Supreme Court Chief Justice. He's been appointed by George W. Bush. And that was a big one about voting rights. And it felt like, in addition to gerrymandering, there was a big effort to really dismantle voting rights. But can you talk a little bit about that? And were there other kinds of efforts, not necessarily even on the Supreme Court level, but on lower court levels, to start to dismantle the voting rights system that we have?
Yeah, dismantling voting rights has really been John Roberts' life's work. You can go back to his days in the Reagan administration as a young person in Washington in the early 1980s. But certainly by the time he is Chief Justice, in Shelby County versus Holder, he eviscerates what had been known as preclearance, which was the crucial enforcement mechanism that prevented the states with the worst histories of racial prejudice in voting from enacting any changes to their laws without pre-approval of them. And that had worked for 50 years to hold back the worst instincts of these states, to keep them in check. And John Roberts in 2013 insisted that things had changed in the South. Congress thought otherwise, right? When Congress reauthorized the Voting Rights Act in 2006, a Republican Senate unanimously 98-0, a Republican House 390-33, a Republican President and George W. Bush signing it into law, along with a 16,000-page report documenting exactly why preclearance was still necessary in all of these states. And Roberts, the humble caller of balls and strikes, ignores all of this, just thrusts it aside and says, well, I think things have changed. He does this in the most dishonest way you can possibly imagine. First, by misreading census data on race that actually says the opposite of what he proclaims it does in his decision. And second, by just making up the law. Roberts makes up the idea of equal sovereignty among states, which he takes from the equal footing doctrine, which has nothing to do with voting rights or any other rights, but has to do with the admission of new states. And he takes a couple of sentences from a previous court case on voting rights that mention the idea of equal sovereignty and how it doesn't apply here, and slices the crucial part out with an ellipsis, deletes it as if it was never there, and says, voila, look at my standard of equal sovereignty. And the trouble with the new day of racial kumbaya that Roberts tried to declare in June of 2013 is that if things had actually changed in the South, that very day was the day that Texas enacts its draconian voter ID bill that preclearance had stopped, and that 700,000 Latinos, this isn't me saying this is the state of Texas admitting that it knew that 700,000 Latinos, citizens, lacked the specific papers that the law now required to vote. One group that didn't lack those actual papers, gun owners.
This is, I like that this is brought up because somebody in the comments section earlier this week tried to argue with me about voter ID and its efficacy in terms of being a law. And the fundamental problem with this argument is that you already have a federal ID assigned to you at birth that is yours and yours alone, which is your social security number. Your social security number is mandatory. You need to know that. You need to have it when you register to vote. And when you actually vote, they confirm it with you. Their social security number, if somebody has that and is using that, you will know, because the Social Security Administration is a federal, like, they'll know if they have safeguards to see if somebody is defrauding you in some way. Credit card companies now will let you know, like, pretty much immediately, like, hey, somebody registered this, or your name appeared on the dark web, or whatever. If you just go in with a photo ID, that doesn't mean anything. Photo IDs are notorious for getting underage kids, drunk, right? They are super easy to come by. Having an ID in and of itself is a monetary cost to voting. The paperwork that you have to do, the money you have to spend on an ID to travel to get there, and the Constitution so far, I mean, who knows what's going to fucking happen now, has said that you cannot put a tax on voting. And this goes back to the founding, like saying, even if the poorest person, walks in and decides to vote, they can vote. And you cannot put any sort of monetary barrier in that way. An ID will put that barrier. And he was like, well, everybody can afford an ID. No, not everyone can. Not everyone has a car to get to a DMV. DMVs are part of the federal and state governments that have been notoriously targeted to be closed down and defunded. There is, hold on a second. I'm not gonna be able to talk. I don't know what's going on here with this guy. Hold on. Oh, you idiot. Why? There we go. So like, if you sit there and say like, well, I need an ID to buy a gun and that's a constitutional right. It's like, no, the government hasn't put that in place, that you need an ID. Those are gun sellers, and voting costs you nothing. You have the right to get a gun, but the government isn't going to pay for it, right? Just like you have the right to get a driver's license at the state level, but they don't have to pay for it, right? You still do. So you have access to it, but it is not a foregone conclusion. So that is, and this is, we're talking not about the possession of something. This is about the fundamental philosophy of participating in a democracy is voting. And that is what the Nazi Party continually is attacking. And even this day, you can go back to this week in Georgia, actually. Again, I think that the Nazi cons have put forth, and they passed a vote, I think in the state house, to hand count every vote. Now, from my very limited understanding of Georgia's state election law, even though that passed, there are already lawsuits to sue that, because that actually goes against the state's own constitution, because it would take too long to certify the national vote. And I think it needs to be within like 3 to 5 days after the election to get all the counts in. And they have machines and processes that do this. I don't know whether it's digital or paper counting or whatever, but to sit there and try and pass a vote that says like, no, they have to be hand counted, that would take weeks or months to do. And so I don't know. The point is that even to this day, they are trying to make it harder for people to vote, because they know those most disenfranchised won't have the 30, 40, 50 bucks to get an ID. They may not have the ability of transportation to a DMV to get the ID. Maybe they're missing some sort of like paperwork at the federal or state level that they have to fill in. They may not have internet, right? They may not have a printer. They may not have the money to go to somewhere and print it out. Like, these are all things that the Nazi Party, they know this, and they are doing their best to exploit it.
Because they were allowed to use their gun license. But if you had a student ID or a public housing ID, not so much. And so Shelby County it liberates all of these legislatures across the South to suddenly do their worst. The prison guard has been removed, and all of those evil dark forces in American politics are free to burst forth again, and so they do. And he closes the federal courts to partisan gerrymandering claims and effectively greenlights not only the gerrymanders that had been in place, but the maximal ones that we saw in the 2021 cycle. And of course, those gerrymanders help create more conservative MAGA caucuses that then pass more insane election laws.
And I think it's Wisconsin. Yeah, I think it's Wisconsin that gerrymandered the state so badly that it's like guaranteed their state Congress will have a supermajority even if they lose across the board of the popular vote. That is how badly gerrymandered it is. Now, I think these are things that there were a couple of court cases. I didn't really follow them just because I don't give two shits about Wisconsin. I'm originally from Minnesota, so I'm like, fuck you, cheeseheads. But yeah, and you see this across, like, just look up the gerrymandering maps in your own state. Every single state has them to a certain degree. Texas, eye patch James Bond villain guy from Texas, I forgot his name, just what an utter fucking moron. This last week he talked about, like, well, solar panels don't really work because they're not generating any electricity at night. The fucking guy, he knows how a battery works. He's playing stupid to play gay to his party in this base. Look at his district. I think it's like a crescent moon shape around like Dallas or something like that. It's just absolutely ridiculous. But that's basically how that seat will always be held by someone who is a conservative.
The court then blesses as perfectly fine under its interpretation of the Voting Rights Act, and how lawmakers ought to be perfectly free to do whatever they want if they think they're fighting voter fraud that they can't actually identify, but as long as they say it's voter fraud, then they're perfectly fine with this court. And all of it works together. All of these decisions at once that have created an anti-democratic cocktail of minority rule.
I feel like the way that John Roberts calls himself an umpire, which is clearly not true, maybe to be fair, referees in the NBA and in baseball should just start calling themselves John Roberts when it's very obvious they've made horribly bad calls. How does this kind of culminate in 2020, we saw Donald Trump's effort to overturn the election. One of his leading supporters, one of his lawyers, John Eastman, was a Federalist Society member, ran a Federalist Society study or debate group at one point in time. The Federalist Society is all over this effort. And I feel that if you tried to make an argument, which I'm sure John Roberts will, which is, look, I've created a very fancy doctrine and document, and I've cited whatever, I made some effort to make it look like this makes sense based on my role as the Chief Justice. This effort by Donald Trump totally blew open, any of that, any semblance of that. And yet you did have these lawyers all over the place supporting it, supporting different candidates for office who were in favor of it. What did you make of the 2020 effort? And I guess I will just leave it at that. What did you make of that entire effort, having been reporting on this stuff for such a long time?
I thought it was really predictable, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there were a lot of us, I think you all as well, who started reporting in March of 2020. This is how they're going to do it. The plan is going to involve gerrymandered state legislatures and tweaking the rules and slowing down the process of certification and trying to send alternate slates of electors and creating a constitutional crisis. They were not able to get away with it in 2020 for a handful of reasons. The general election popular vote was too big in too many places. But also the legal work was really shoddy. It's Rudy Giuliani, half in the bag at the Four Seasons landscaping.
With a little hair dye coming down.
It's a clown car. And they filed all these cases too late, right?
Yeah.
They brought them all after the election. And if you look at what most of these courts said, they said, why are you bringing us this now? And so what I think happened in 2020 is not so much that the courts stepped up and saved American democracy, but that conservatives learned, oh, if we want to do this, we have to do this a little bit differently. We have to bring the cases earlier, and we have to have control of these other boards that handle certification in advance. And so this time around, you've got the white shoe DC Consovoy McCarthy firms and others handling these cases. The adults in the room have got it. They will dress them up with the appropriate Federalist Society hothouse theories. And the cases have been brought. There's already more than 75 cases in 16 states that the RNC is either brought or is an amicus party to. And those 5 weeks between Election Day and the Safe Harbor Day are crucial. And if you can slow that process down, if you can kick it into the courts, you can create all kinds of constitutional mischief.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what I have been thinking about. And then you look at some of the previous things that have come up, the elimination of the Chevron doctrine, which, required them to defer to federal agencies, and especially the overturning of Roe v. Wade. I mean, just overturning precedent, and now you have these 6 people who have a total lock on the Supreme Court. And so, what is the safeguard against that then? Because you do have Democrats, some of them trying to fashion, but Joe Biden in particular was, really saying, well, if I get elected, it will be the safeguard of democracy, it will be this. But in a lot of ways, it feels like the master plan, the plot worked. They got the 6-3 on the court. They've given presidents full immunity. That was very clearly directed at Donald Trump. And I'm not, a legal scholar. I didn't go to law school. So I guess I'm wondering, how does this story end? Does it just end with essentially 6 people until they die telling us how we're going to be able to do and, invalidating our Congress and our politics?
And this is what a lot of people have talked about. The problem, the only way, because we have the filibuster, if you don't know what the filibuster is, I'm not going to go into great detail, but basically it's a way for I think the Senate in particular to stop legislation. So if we need to have, sorry, I'm finishing up my coffee. We need to have a Congress, meaning a democratically majority in both the House and the Senate, and a somewhat Democrat in the presidency, and you need to pass national legislation. That is the only way to get out of this situation, because what that does is then it forces lawsuits to work its way up to the Supreme Court. But when it is law, that could take years. We could have retirements or, hopefully deaths on the Supreme Court to replace them with younger Supreme Court justices. And that's really the only workaround where, because if you pass like a presidential executive order or something, the next president can just overturn that. It can be challenged in so many other easy ways. So that's really the system, but you have to get rid of the filibuster in order for that to occur.
Well, or is there some mechanism that it doesn't rectify it, but it at least pushes back against that?
No matter where your politics lie, I would think that all Americans would be deeply uncomfortable with the idea that any 9 Americans should hold this much power in a representative democracy. And indeed, I think the polls show that people are. If you look at the polls on term limits, on a real ethics clause for these justices, it's upwards of 70 to 75% of Americans backing this, including upwards of 70% of Republicans. So this is popular, and we are going to have to reform this court or accept that it intends to rule over our lives. If Vice President Harris is elected, she's going to have to decide between having an agenda that she can enact through Congress, or having an agenda that is blocked by this court every step of the way. This is a moment for us to be thinking about dramatic Supreme Court reform. We have to be thinking about how we strip a jurisdiction on some cases from these judges. We have to be thinking about how we expand and right size this court. We need to be thinking about a real ethics responsibilities that stop these justices from being corrupted and paid by those who have interests before them. It is time to think big and immediately and urgently about all of this. I mean, Lincoln in his first inaugural says, "The candid citizen must confess that if the policy of the government upon the vital questions affecting the whole people is to be irrevocably fixed by the decisions of the Supreme Court, the people will have ceased to be their own rulers." And we're dangerously close to that moment right now. I mean, Justice Gorsuch is the man who Leonard Leo spent $10 million to keep his seat warm when Mitch McConnell blocked Merrick Garland's nomination. Leonard Leo spent an additional $10 million to hand and install Gorsuch in that seat for a lifetime. And Gorsuch has spent the last 7 years delivering decisions that justify the investment in his career. I think perhaps the justice has a different definition of judicial independence than I do.
Well, David, the book is Anti-Democratic Inside the Far Right's 50-Year Plot to Control American Elections. I think that should be on every civic syllabus going forward. Thank you so much for the conversation. It was great to have you on the show.
Really a pleasure. Thank you so much for all of the work you and Lever do. It's just very, very important.
Wow, that was way more interesting than I thought it was going to be, and touched on a lot of points that I am interested in talking more about on these podcasts. I did not get to the tanking portion of ESO because I still have, oh my god, how many surveys? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Wow, holy crap. This is a good week. So I still have a lot of these to go through. But anyway, I hope you guys found this insightful. Get out. If you're not already registered to vote, you need to do that. And hopefully you do not live in a heavily gerrymandered state where they want to negate your vote. Good luck, America.